And now it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of our next panel as well. He's someone that wants to make sure that you actually drank every last drop of that coffee because he's paying for it, and it's not cheap, you know. Jim Armour is the Vice President of Summa Strategies, a government relations firm here in Ottawa. He served as Communications Director for Preston Manning, for Stephen Harper, and the Canadian Medical Association. So while he's been on the receiving end of a number of bruisings over the years, he also has the ability to apply his own tourniquet as well. His motto is, "Bacon is the answer." What was the question? Jim. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dave. So thanks very much, Dave, for that introduction. Now, before I begin, I just want to make sure that everybody is in the right room. For the next 60 minutes or so, we're going to be discussing and debating neoliberal reforms in the macroeconomic policy in Peru and what impact they have on Canada. So I'm sure all of the panelists have prepared remarks. Just wanted to see what it was like to turn the tables on a group of journalists. Actually, our topic this morning is the strength and weaknesses of Conservatives in Canada. Now, I'm sure the panelists will have no problem identifying the latter. I'm really looking forward to what they have to say about the former. Now, the way things are going to work is each panelist is going to have up to 10 minutes. I'm sure they may not use all 10 minutes. And then whatever time is left, we'll have a bit of a discussion, a few questions. So, on with the introductions. Get it all straight here. Now, I have a bit of a Manning Centre exclusive. Sources close to the press gallery have told me and confirmed that John Ivison is from Scotland. And following his move to Canada, he joined the Financial Post as a journalist, eventually becoming deputy editor. Heckling already. I didn't expect that so early in the introduction.
Were you out drinking with John last night?
No, he's not lying down. He can't be out drinking with John last night. So from the Financial Post, he then moved to the National Post, where he covered provincial politics at Queen's Park. He's a frequent contributor to a number of public affairs programs, and so we welcome John to the panel this morning. You can applaud loudly if you want for John. Now, next to John is Luisa Savage. She's the Washington bureau chief for Maclean's magazine, and she covers Washington politics. She's also the producer and host of Pipeline Politics, which is a documentary about the Keystone XL controversy that's airing on CPAC, and identified that as an issue, problem, controversy long before anybody else. She's got a bachelor degree in economics from Harvard, master's degree in legal studies from Yale, and obviously maybe the smartest person on the panel, I don't know. But I'm going to avoid asking Luisa questions because she'll probably have the answers, and that'll put me at a disadvantage. Next to Luisa is a familiar face here on Parliament Hill, Bob Fife, veteran reporter. I think that's code for old, actually. Now, he's been covering national politics since 1978. So yeah, I think veteran is... currently, Bob is the bureau chief of CTV News, as well as the host of their landmark political program, Question Period, author of many books. I looked up in the Conservative thesaurus for adjectives to describe Bob, and tenacious was the kindest thing that I could find. His reporting has led to the downfall of the political careers of many a politician in Ottawa. Let's just put it this way. If you're planning to go to Fairfax later on this afternoon for the lunch special, do not say that Bob sent you. And next to Bob, Jennifer Ditchburn, senior parliamentary correspondent with the Ottawa Bureau of Canadian Press. She's been covering conservative politics, Canadian Alliance, progressive conservative leaderships. She's won a national newspaper award. I also happen to know that in her spare time, she's doing her master's degree at Carleton. And I think I speak for grad students everywhere when I say, do not ask her how the thesis is going. So, with that, I'm going to turn things over to John.
Thank you, Jim. Do these go up? They do. Everybody here? I'm here to inform you regretfully that the blueprint for the next Conservative election campaign has been leaked. My colleagues at the Toronto Star and other media outlets have been running excerpts from this plan, and the culprit has been identified and banished for leaving the document in clear public view so negligently. In fact, I don't think Tom Flanagan will ever be the Prime Minister's best friend ever again. Sitting in the front row here. After the publication of Harper's Team, because that's what I'm talking about. Behind the scenes in the Conservative rise to power. I think it's a bit redundant almost to talk about the broad sweep of Conservative strategy in the infamous leaked documents to the Toronto Star, which they were running this month. The strategy has been known for a decade. It's been as constant as the Northern Star, and Tom pretty much blew the lid on it with a blow-by-blow account in 2007. Clearly, the strategy has worked in the past, and I'm going to talk a little bit about whether I think it's going to work in the future. I would start off by saying the auspices are not good for the Blue team. I think the most recent polling, as you'll all be well aware, is that Justin Trudeau is well ahead when voters are asked who would make the best Prime Minister. A worrying one, I think, for the Prime Minister's office will be the finding by Nick Nanos that the pool of available Conservative voters is at almost an all-time low under the current regime. Only 36% of voters would now consider voting Conservative, compared to 48% for the Liberals and 42% for the NDP. The horse race number you're well aware of has the Liberals around 7 points ahead. Although when the question is asked that's of eligible voters, when it's asked of likely voters, it narrows considerably, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Angus Reid this week had the time for change number at 58%, which is always, to me, a leading indicator. When it gets into the 60s, I think it's perilously dangerous, very hard to turn back. And so it's no wonder that some over-caffeinated pundits who were talking at Christmas parties to highly placed sources suggested that the Prime Minister might want to spend more time with his plus-minus statistics. That was me, by the way, and I did not predict he would go. I just was talking to people who suggested maybe he's thinking about it. But to use a sporting analogy that's more familiar to me, the Blues are only one down. It's early in the second half, and nobody's booted the pretty boy star striker of the Red team up in the air yet. I think there is all still to play for, in that the polling averages for January showed the Conservatives up marginally after some steady losses. The Liberals were down a couple of points compared to the same polling companies in October. The NDP were up because of the strong performance of Tom Mulcair in the House. Regionally, the Liberals made gains in Atlantic Canada and even in Alberta, while the NDP showed some strength in the prairies. But crucially, it seemed to me that in Ontario there were signs of a modest Conservative revival. One Angus Reid finding was of particular interest to me. While 38% feel that the country is on the wrong track, 32% believe it's on the right track, and 30% are uncertain. I think it's no coincidence that the Conservative fortunes have been waxing and waning in direct relation to the prominence of the Senate scandal in the headlines. Not much was written in January and February, while Mr Harper scored some successes on the policy front: Israel, First Nations Education Act, citizenship reforms, the new Fair Elections Act, and a budget that did no harm, even if it did no good. In this circumstance, I think that voters seem to remember they respect Mr Harper's competence and his consistency. When the question of competence is isolated in polls, the dependable Conservative journeyman of Canadian politics outpolls Justin Trudeau 2-1. Yet when the Senate is in the news, voters remember that he's been in their face for nearly a decade. They're fed up with him, and let's be charitable, they're fed up with his unique brand of executive democracy. I think if I was in Conservative HQ, I'd be nervous about that statistic I talked about, the shrinking universe of Conservative voters. I would also be positively neurotic about the prospect of charges coming down on Mike Duffy and Nigel Wright. I think if that happens, and Mr Harper is called as a witness, you have this saga continuing right through to the election. I mean, we do have the Auditor General's report coming out, but I think the poop will be spread pretty widely there because the Liberals will be dragged into that too. But looking at it, I've been asked myself, is there anything that the Conservatives could do differently that would make a huge difference? And the conclusion I came to is probably nothing much. Probably the secret of success is to continue what they're doing, but do it much better. Much of the narrative is out of the government's control, so they have to perform to the best of their abilities in the areas where they do have oversight. The success of the Conservative brand, it seems to me, is like a popular wood sealant in the UK, which sold millions on the back of the slogan, "It does exactly what it says in the tin." And, you know, the Conservatives retain a lot of advantages of a governing party: legislative tools, parliamentary resources, fiscal levers. The party should get a boost from next year's budget as the country emerges from the black and families get some relief. I still think it will be in the form of expanded or extended child benefit rather than income splitting, but I think there certainly has been blowback from the caucus. Just on that, I do not think that Jim Flaherty was offside with the Prime Minister. I think they were precisely onside, and they floated this as a trial balloon, and the caucus and presumably a lot of Conservative voters didn't like the idea that they weren't going to fulfil an election promise. So income splitting may still be on the table, but I think from an electoral point of view, the child benefit thing wins hands down if you're going to spend an extra $2.5 billion. Other rays of hope for the Conservatives: the opposition parties remain at each other's throats. The battle between the NDP and the Liberals in Quebec and parts of downtown Vancouver and Toronto for progressive voters should ensure there's no tidal wave. I don't see a collapse on either side. The NDP in Quebec, I was on a panel last week with Jean Lapierre, who watches Quebec pretty closely. He thought that they may lose a number of seats and end up with 35, but even 35 seats in Quebec keeps a pretty strong NDP caucus. But I think if there is strict adherence to the 10 commandments so helpfully laid down by Mr. Flanagan, that goes a long way to dictating success or failure. And they are, just lest you've forgotten, unity. The coalition of interests in the party, they have to hang together or they're going to hang separately. I think that despite the fact there have been ministers offside, murmurings on the back benches, I think they'll come together in the next 12 to 15 months. I don't think unity will be an issue. Moderation: the party can't win if it veers too far from the median voter. Policy-wise, I don't see anything too radical coming down. Inclusion: they've got to keep the Francophone and minority groups on side. Incrementalism: the willingness to take small practical steps. As Tom said, sweeping visions have a place in the intellectual discussion, but they're toxic in practical policies, which is a message that the Trudeau Liberals do not seem to have got. I was at the convention last week, and their idea of, without raising taxes or cutting spending, committing to $18 billion worth of new infrastructure spending by piling it onto the national debt, I think that opens huge doors of opportunity for the Conservatives to attack them. Policy, comment on moderation above. Self-discipline. As my good friend Doug Findlay used to say, don't talk to the media, which was a practice which he preached but did not practice, I'm glad to say. Toughness. We cannot win by being the Boy Scouts, Mr. Flanagan again. See my above comments about running the cleats down the back of Mr. Trudeau's legs. And grassroots politics: I think the Conservatives have huge advantage as far as winning one vote at a time. That the voter ID, the technology as far as identifying voters and raising money is still vastly superior to what the Liberals have got, although they are catching up on the back of Mr. Trudeau's charisma. And persistence: the party must learn from study its mistakes and learn from them. I am not so optimistic on that front. It seems that this government continues to make the same mistakes as if it was Groundhog Day. The lack of statesmanship in inviting opposition members on the Ukraine trip, I thought, was pretty unconscionable. We were trying to sell Ukraine the idea of democracy, and we did not allow our opposition members to take part, even though it was a government delegation. We sent opposition members on government delegations before, to Mandela's funeral, to the inauguration of the Mexican president. It seemed to me cheap and petty, and I think that it reminds people why they do not like this iteration of conservatism. So I have to admit I have a hard time seeing another Conservative majority. In the event of a minority, it's entirely possible that Justin Trudeau is talking hogwash when he said that he would never form a coalition government with Tom Mulcair, who seemed weirdly enthusiastic about the idea this week. Talking to NDP guys, what was he thinking about to embrace the idea? He's not a quitter, but he didn't sound like a winner. But in the event of that unholy alliance, I find it hard to see how it could live long and prosper. The lesson from the UK is that the kind of deal is the road to electoral oblivion for at least one of the parties. And I think if the Conservatives were consigned to the penalty box by a coalition, the prospects of a swift return to government would be pretty good. I don't think that Trudeau will do it, because I think that he is in it for the long term. And if he has 100 new MPs, he becomes Prime Minister of a very weak coalition, and he's backed up by Tom Mulcair, who's stabbing him in the front and the back, it would be a short-lived affair. And he does not want to go down in history as the guy who was, Prime Minister for 5 minutes. To wrap up, 4 months after Stephen Harper was elected, Frank Luntz came to Ottawa. Many of you are probably there, and gave the keynote speech where he said that people don't vote for policies but for emotional reasons and intangible personality traits: trust, competence and stability. I think that the Prime Minister continues to score quite well on those criteria, which suggests to me we're going to see a very tight race in 2004. I think in the era of political branding, the best hope is to do exactly what it says in the tin. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've spent the last decade in Washington, D.C. watching events in Ottawa from the outside, and I've actually attended a great many conservative political action conferences in Washington, but this is my first Manning conference, so thank you for inviting me. My perspective is going to be necessarily comparative. What are the comparative strengths and weaknesses of the Canadian conservative movement as opposed to the American movement? So there are obviously many ways to answer this question, but I'm just going to pick two. So the first one is, what is a relative strength of Canadian Conservatives right now? And I think it's very obvious, with big long-term implications, that it's the Conservatives' embrace of immigration. Now, in the 2011 federal election, the polls I've seen suggest that the Conservative Party of Canada won roughly a third, or around 30% of the immigrant vote, and Liberals won just over a quarter. Now compare this to what happened in the presidential election in 2012. Mitt Romney, the Republican candidate, won 27% of the Hispanic vote, and I'm going to focus on the Hispanics in particular. Barack Obama won 71%. 71. This is in the context of an election where Obama won 51% of the vote. This is a potential existential crisis for Republicans. After the election, the Republican National Committee put out a 100-page roadmap with 219 recommendations for change. They were very worried about this, and they pointed out in their document that Hispanics make up 17% of the population and were 10% of the electorate in 2012, but they're projected to make up 29% of the US population in 2050. So this is the fastest growing segment of voters. Here in Canada, conservative activists, whatever they may think about immigration, have given the Conservative Party the political space to go after the immigrant vote and ethnic communities in a very aggressive way. That used to be the strength of the Liberals, and no longer. Although I understand you've seen polling at this conference that suggests that some of that advantage is now eroding. But I think it's a very interesting area. So Reince Priebus, the head of the RNC, was very outspoken after the last election about the view that the problem for the Republicans was actually coming from both statements by the candidates, such as Mitt Romney talking about wanting undocumented immigrants to self-deport, but also from the grassroots. And Priebus said, if Hispanic Americans perceive that a GOP candidate or nominee does not want them in the United States, they will not pay attention to our next sentence. So they realize this, they know this at the top. And like Canadian Conservatives, American Republicans believe that their party is the natural home for immigrants who are more likely to share their views on traditional family values, on entrepreneurship, more likely to attend church services and so on. And they even have a potential Hispanic presidential hopeful waiting in the wings in the form of Cuban-American Senator from Florida, Marco Rubio. But their message on immigration has been mixed at best. The business wing of the party really wants to see comprehensive immigration reform. They want to bring in more skilled immigrants, and they want to find some way of legalizing, if not offering, a path to citizenship for the estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. But many people in the grassroots oppose this vehemently, and they are threatening to topple candidates who support this kind of reform. They argue it's a matter of rule of law, that there are immigration laws, and if you break them, then you should be deported or asked to leave. So it's an internal division, but it's not helping the party, and it's not helping the movement. And for years, the US Congress, even under the Bush administration, has been trying to overhaul the US immigration system. In June, the US Senate passed comprehensive immigration reform that had two-thirds support, more than two-thirds support, and included 14 Republican senators. And the question is, are those votes now going to be used against them by the party's own grassroots? Speaker Boehner was just meeting with Obama this week and said their main area of agreement is on immigration, and immediately conservative activists went after Boehner on that point. So the Republican-controlled House leadership so far has refused to bring the Senate legislation up for a vote. And this year may be the last chance that that could happen in some form. So this is the big issue to watch right now for the conservative movement. Obviously in Canada the landscape is different. Canada does not have 11 million undocumented immigrants and has long had an immigration policy that focuses on skills, not on family reunification. But that said, just the fact that they were able to identify this as an issue and go after it, and then not challenge, not try to bring down Jason Kenney for his efforts on that score, to me is just a huge structural difference. So now turning to the relative weakness of the Canadian conservative movement. Just for some background, before I moved to the US, I spent several years covering the Supreme Court of Canada here in Ottawa in the Justice Department. And it was very clear to me that in both countries, many of the big social and economic issues are decided by the courts. But when I arrived in Washington, what was so striking to me was the profound difference in the legal politics. There was this enormous diversity in legal and constitutional thinking, which of course is manifested by these deep splits on the US Supreme Court on big controversial issues. Now, some people in Canada look at that and attribute it to politicization of judges, that Republicans appoint right-wing judges, Democrats appoint left-wing judges, so you get a split. And because there are now a lot of conservatives on the court, you get these conservative decisions. But what I saw was actually a deep and sophisticated school of legal thinking in the United States, which transcends just an individual conservative judge's partisan leanings. There is an extensive and well-funded system of conservative legal institutions, a counterpart to which I don't see in Canada. So this conservative legal movement is almost like a mirror-like parallel to what the Canadian conservatives did on immigration. For years, the legal politics had been dominated by big liberal groups like the ACLU, the NAACP, that were taking cases through strategic litigation and winning at the courts, just like the liberals used to win the immigrant vote. So until a handful of conservatives decided they wanted to change things. And I was really interested in the story of this because I'd heard that there was an application for a Christian law school to open up at Trinity Western University in British Columbia. And I thought, you know, how does this relate to the conservative legal movement in the United States? Would it be the first step to a similar conservative legal institution building in Canada? And I started to look into how this high-powered modern legal movement got built in the United States. And I talked to a historian at the University of Denver. His name's Josh Wilson. And he said that he traced it back to the Roe v. Wade decision, 1973, constitutionalizing abortion rights. And he said in the backlash, there were all these protesters getting arrested around clinics protesting abortions in the United States. They needed lawyers. Conservative states were trying to roll back abortion rights. They ended up in courts. And there were Christian lawyers all over the United States taking these cases. But the first one to really see the long-term big picture of this was the televangelist, Pat Robertson. And he was the head of the Christian Coalition and the Christian Broadcasting Network. And he had a lot of money. And in 1986, he formed his own law school, the Regent University School of Law. And now the faculty there includes former Attorney General John Ashcroft. One of the alumni is Bob McDonnell, who was two-term governor of Virginia. And it was under the Bush administration sort of a pipeline to jobs in the administration. But alongside his law school, he created something called the American Center for Law and Justice. And this was a public interest law firm that had a long-term vision of looking for cases in lower courts around the United States and nurturing them up through the system to the point where they could actually change the law when they got to appellate courts, sometimes the Supreme Court. So he had like-minded lawyers there. He had a law school with students who were the pipeline feeding this legal movement. In 1999, Tom Monahan, who is the founder of Domino's Pizza, he created Ave Maria School of Law, which is now in Naples, Florida. Same idea. In 2004, Jerry Falwell, another televangelist, created Liberty University School of Law and also a public interest law firm, Liberty Counsel. And a lot of these ideas have moved into the mainstream. You now have Stanford University that has opened a clinic to litigate religious liberties cases. And I think that's very interesting in light of the whole Quebec Values Charter issue. So I did a piece on this recently in Maclean's, and I talked to some law professors and former law students from Canada who ended up in the US, or some who saw their students end up in the US, and they said, well, we feel there's not a lot of ideological diversity in law schools here in Canada, and we see students often leaving to go to conservative law schools and religiously affiliated law schools in the United States. So I thought, well, what about this TWU thing? Is this the seed of this kind of conservative legal institution? So I spoke with Janet at Buckingham, who's one of the people pushing that application, and she said she'd actually toured these US law schools to see what they were about, but this was not her plan to create an activist institution, and she said students there were both from the left and the right. But one of the conservative professors I spoke to said, who knows what can happen when you get a critical mass of like-minded people. So I leave you with that thought. I think it's an interesting structural difference, and we'll see where it takes us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to the Manning Conference. I appreciate being here. I'm going to speak to an issue that I think resonates with a lot of conservatives, but not necessarily with the people in power, and it wouldn't matter whether they were liberal, New Democrats, or liberals. We've witnessed over the last year what we've seen as an unaccountable Senate, which is an institution that has largely a political payoff, where taxpayers' dollars are treated as a personal piggy bank, not just as a personal piggy bank for the senators who are lucky enough to win the pot of gold under the parliamentary rainbow, but it's because the parties put them in there to do their own biddings. This is the way for taxpayers to pay, to have basically paid political staff to do their bidding, whether to raise money or to run campaigns. But it's not a legislative institution that you would think it would be, where they're doing serious work. A lot of it is work that's done largely on the basis of the party. And think about this. They work on average 69 days a year. I'm not making that up. That's the figure. The Senate, as we talked about earlier, is in desperate need of reform, but I want to say that the Senate spending scandals at least has led to greater transparency and accountability in the Senate. And to some extent in the House of Commons, we'll see more accountability when the Auditor General is finished combing through its very extensive review of the Senate spending. They have 40 auditors working on all of these senators. And as I've been told, that I think we're going to find some ugly stuff coming out of this, and no doubt more police investigations of senators. But we still have a problem on the other side. That's the elected House, where power comes supposedly from the people. I just want to ask you for a second to think about before the last election, there were 3 members of Parliament, 3 Liberal members of Parliament, who did the same thing as the other senators did and who are now under police investigation. They were using their house allowance. It was, they were pocketing the housing expenses. They got caught. They paid back the money. It was all kept secret. The police weren't called in. This was a club made up of all the parties, the Bloc Québécois at the time. The Board of Internal Economy, which runs the House of Commons, has a budget of $500 million. You and I don't know how they spend that money. It's all kept secret. We get, every 3 months, we get a piece of paper about like that, where they make some decisions. Imagine, $500 million, that's all they let us know. There was an effort after the Senate scandal to open up the Board of Internal Economy so that Canadians would have a better idea of how our money is spent in the House of Commons. Conservative members refused to do so. Imagine, people who brought the Reform Party to Ottawa and changed the nature of the Conservative Party wouldn't let the Board of Internal Economy be open. As we know, the Auditor General is doing a very extensive review of the Senate. There is no review of the House of Commons by the Auditor General. When Sheila Fraser tried to do so, Jay Hill, who was then the House Leader at the time, fought it tooth and nail until the country rose up to support Ms. Fraser. But the House of Commons limited her review to a very, very limited area of the House of Commons. There should be in our democracy regular, extensive reviews of the House of Commons and Senate. After all, we are paying for it. It's not their club. We elected them. And it goes to, I think, what I think is, in terms of our elected legislators, a malaise in our democratic institutions. Pierre Trudeau used to say MPs are nobodies 50 feet off Parliament Hill. Well, he couldn't be more wrong. Members of Parliament, I think, are still command respect and authority in their ridings. It's on Parliament Hill where they don't really have a lot of respect. Parliament has become really an ivory tower where grown-ups play follow the leader, and leaving the path is a very dangerous game. Every leader since Brian Mulroney, and I've been here, I can tell you that, every leader since Brian Mulroney has promised to reform Parliament and to give MPs a real say in governing the country. And I will credit Mulroney, there was some changes with the McGraw report that did give MPs some say. But every leader from Mulroney on, Chrétien, Martin, Harper, they all ran on election campaigns of promising to make our fundamental parliamentary institutions more accountable and to lessen the control of the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office. And every leader since then has concentrated even more power in the hands of the Prime Minister's office, his tight advisors, and the Privy Council office. And to some extent, we understood why the Conservatives did that when they first came into office. They were in a minority government situation. It was very precarious, and it was completely understandable why they did that. And I think in minority government situations, everybody can understand that. But but it's not acceptable when you have a majority government. MPs today have more staff, time, equipment, money, and education than ever before. We are represented by a very fine group of men and women in the House of Commons. We all know them, greatest respect for them. But unfortunately, they don't have any influence or oversight over how the government spends taxpayers' money, which is supposed to be their first duty. It used to be many years ago, when a budget came down, the very next day, the spending estimates would be introduced. There was a lockup for the spending estimates. That's because the budget and the spending estimates matched each other. So you knew exactly what the government was spending the very next day, and you could comb through that, and you had a real understanding of how the budget was allocated and how the money was spent. Those days are long gone. That doesn't happen anymore. In fact, it often happens that the spending estimates are tabled before the budget, and that's happened a couple of times. So Parliament, which is the place that's supposed to be able to look at how spending estimates are done, they have no idea. No idea at all how our government is spending. In fact, we have the parliamentary budget officer who is pleading for the finance department to give him information so he can tell Canadians how our money is being spent, and they won't give it to him. Think about that. Our money, they're keeping it. Why? It's beyond belief. The only way we have any idea of how our money is spent is once a year we get to look at the public accounts, which is it's the end of the year books, which tells you how the money is spent. That's the only way you have any idea. And Parliament is supposed to play the role of being able to question how money is spent, and that is simply not happening. Legislation brought before the House of Commons is already in its almost final form. And sadly, ministers treat proposed amendments to their bills almost like it's a personal attack on them, when it's in fact the job and duty of parliamentarians to say, you know what, this doesn't really make very sense. We've heard from witnesses. They say that this bill doesn't make any sense. Let's change it. There are occasional changes to bills. I don't say that there isn't, but often the case is they're presented to the House, they go to committee, they're rushed through, and there isn't really the kind of legislative debate and changes and amendments to legislation the way it should be. Now, it's sacrosanct in our parliamentary system that Cabinet has the right and duty to manage and to initiate policy and determine budgets. But Parliament also has a duty to oversee the managers and to propose ideas and solutions. But party discipline is so sternly enforced in Canada. I mean, just compare it to Great Britain, the mother of all parliaments. There's far less party discipline. MPs in Britain can spout views contrary to their party leaders, and dissenting votes are frequent when the government's survival is not at stake. But that doesn't happen here. Every issue is treated as though defeat and a general election depend upon it, when they actually have nothing to do. Most pieces of legislation, in fact, have nothing to do with party policy that they ran on. It's just legislation that crops up because the government is doing this job. Surely to God, people can have the free right to be able to look at the legislation, make changes, and more important, to be able to vote freely if it doesn't affect the government's, if the government's not going to be defeated as a result of it. Now, I'm not telling you anything that's really new. The decline of Parliament due to an all-powerful PMO and a burgeoning unchecked bureaucracy has been talked about for decades. We've seen numerous studies going back at least from the Lambert Report in 1979, and as I mentioned, the Graw Report, and so on. They've all pointed to the same problem. That is, there needs to be a shift of power to autonomous committees. And there is no reason in the world why we can't beef up our committees so that they have proper research, and that a cabinet can say to them, when these are basically, a lot of these bills are non-contentious in the sense, some of the law and order bills, for example, you might be able to, or health bills or whatnot, you can send them to committee and say, okay, here's the overriding principles that we would like to see, or even give them a draft bill, but you are free then to draft the legislation, and the Conservatives have a majority anyway, so they would end up being able to overrule bills if they thought that the other parties were playing politics with it. But give them the opportunity to be adults, to do their job as legislators. Let them have a role in the central function of our parliamentary system. And free votes, my goodness, what's wrong with free votes? But it's treated like, I mean, there are free votes on private members' bill for the most part, but there could be more free votes on a lot of non-contentious issues. Let members of Parliament act for their constituents and loosen the party discipline. There is no reason in the world why everything has to be controlled by the Prime Minister's office and the Whip's office. I mean, it's insulting, and MPs will tell you it's insulting to have some young person coming up who's 22 or 25 saying, here's the speech you have to read, which may not have any relevancy to the member of Parliament from Saskatchewan who wants to be able to speak and define the government's principles but from the point of view of somebody from Saskatchewan. Not somebody in the Prime Minister's office who's written some speech that has no meaning, it's just a bunch of talking points. The value of our parliamentary system in a big country like our country is to allow people to express the views of their constituents. We all learn from it. And I'm telling you, we're getting to the point here where you feel you are in a neutered system. And finally, the other thing is there just simply has to be better parliamentary oversight. Do you think that if we had proper parliamentary oversight that we would have allowed the government to spend $2.5 million of Canadian taxpayers' money on job grants for a program that didn't even exist? Of course not. The program didn't exist, so we spent the money. But there's no oversight. Parliament has no role. And finally, I just want to say that for Conservatives, they should be thinking seriously and long about how they want to be able to come back to their roots, because I know that this is an issue that's at the heart of Conservatives who tend to be very grassroots, tend to be populist, tend to understand that these are the kind of issues that resonates with them. Justin Trudeau is now talking about some of the things that you used to talk about when you were reformers in the early days of the Harper government. And why is he talking about that? Because he knows it resonates with Canadians. If we're at a situation here where fewer and fewer Canadians are voting, well, they're not voting because our parliamentary institutions are not responding to them. So my view as somebody who's been around a very, very long time and who cares very much and feels very fortunate to have worked and work every day in the House of Commons, I'd really like to be able to see our institution be reformed, and so that the many good people that we elect actually have a very serious role in the governing of our country. Thank you.
So I figure I'm taking a bullet for the panel by taking on the subject of the Conservative movement and the media. And I have a sort of grade 7 level PowerPoint presentation for you. But perhaps I should start by saying what Andre Turcotte said before his panel yesterday, which was, don't shoot the messenger. So let's see if I can work this patente. I thought I'd butter you up with someone that we're all familiar with, Sir John A. Macdonald. Now, we all know what Sir John A.'s role was in the birth of our nation, but he was also important to developing a particular attitude towards the media in this country. Even before Confederation, Sir John A. was one of the voices in the province of Canada calling for the presence of parliamentary reporters in the Assembly so that they could report back on what the legislators were doing and saying. Even after Confederation, it was Sir John A. Macdonald who stood up in the House and said no to an opposition attempt to eject reporters from the Commons. And I'll just add this other little piece of trivia. I'm sure most of you know this, but some of the fathers of Confederation were journalists themselves, Thomas D'Arcy McGee and George Brown, just two of them. So this is something I'm very proud of as a Canadian and as a member of the Press Gallery, and that's that when Parliament opened, there was a National Press Gallery. You know, the role of the press in the fledgling democracy at that time was just accepted. It was in 1881 that we first had an official Hansard. That's 20 years before that of the United Kingdom. They actually had to send a parliamentary committee over from London to study our system and our press gallery. So let me just bring this around to present day, in case you're wondering where I'm going with all this. When Michael Chong introduced his Reform Act 2013 last December, I had this nagging feeling that something was missing from this. Chong says that he wants to rebalance power between Parliament and the executive, and to reinforce that sacred concept that the Prime Minister and his cabinet are responsible to MPs and not the other way around. He complained that the centralization of power, and Bob just talked about this, has only gotten worse from the Trudeau years onward. Now, I don't want to comment on the substance of Michael's bill, but I will say this. How can MPs ever hope to rebalance that power if they've ceded control over something as fundamental as their ability to speak freely and to speak their minds and to not be scripted by unelected managers in the Prime Minister's office or in the party? Make no mistake about it, communications is power. And as a reporter who picks up on gaffes, I understand the allure of message control, but at what cost? We've arrived at a point, at this point, where MPs have been programmed not to talk to the media, many of them are afraid to talk to us, or even ask their own question during a committee meeting, which I find sad and disturbing. I see what's happened on Parliament Hill in the last 8 years as being a rupture of that messy but necessary covenant that successive governments and Confederation have had with the media, and the press gallery in particular. I can't see a better example of this than this week when MP Mark Adler appeared at the Ethics Committee to present his private member's bill to bring more transparency to the offices of agents of Parliament. Mr. Adler must have used the word transparency about 12 times during his talk and talked about how Canadians want more information and more accountability. But Mr. Adler couldn't find 1 minute to speak to the 10 reporters that were in the room who wanted to talk to him about the bill and about another issue that, of which he was in the news. So, some of you might have been at the convention last December or last November, but the centralized, highly controlled communications approach amazingly even extended to the party's convention. You'll recall that reporters had limited access outside of the plenaries to the delegates, and none at all to the official social events. This is quite a contrast from the Reform and Canadian Alliance days, which Jim and I remember, and Bob. I recall I would be able to call riding association presidents or national councillors, party officials, talk to them about the constitution of the party rules, leadership rules. That's all but died a slow death in the last 8 years. But all of these stories would form the basis, all of these issues would form the basis of stories. We reported regularly on these things. But what's happened now, I think, is that there's been a separation between the two groups who care deeply about politics in Canada and about civic engagement. So, as Bob also mentioned, many of us in the media feel a sense of duty to engage people in politics and civic debate and to keep politicians accountable. But for the past 8 years, there's been no recognition of the role of journalists, what we have to play in engaging people and teaching them about responsible government. I'm not convinced that Facebook and Twitter are an appropriate replacement for this. So this brings me to the second half of my talk. These are some of the issues that I think that Conservatives should care about. I really like this quote by Sir Winston Churchill. He said this during the luncheon in 1945 with their own press gallery, and he said, "The long fight which the House had against being reported is succeeded by the long fight which it's going to have over being reported at all." So the number one thing that I think Conservatives should be worried about is an overall decline in parliamentary coverage. These are just some of the newspapers that don't have correspondents in Ottawa anymore. They've all left in the last 15 years, and the situation's only getting worse. Barry Wilson, the veteran reporter for the Western Producer, who retired last month after 34 years, told me that 10 years ago when he would go to the Agriculture Committee, there'd be up to 10 reporters there. With Barry gone, if they don't replace him, I wonder if there'd be a single reporter at Agriculture Committee anymore. The next thing that I think you should all care about is shrinking or disappearing newsrooms across the country. These are some of the newspapers that have folded in the last year. The Lindsay Post and the Midland Free Press were more than 100 years old. The Meadow Lake Progress in Manitoba was 82 years old. Incidentally, all of these in Conservative ridings. How do you reach constituents anymore without newspapers? Normally, in a normal situation, these would be major points of public policy, or public policy concerns, rather. And the third, and this is one of my huge beefs, is a politicized, throttled system of government information. I don't think people truly understand what's happened to government information in this country. Now it's almost impossible to get a straight, factual answer from a government department, and they're supposed to be nonpartisan. If I put a question to any government department these days and I ask for some technical information, usually you can wait a few days, more than a week for the information to come back to you, and what you get is usually a bit of propaganda. Why should you care? Well, this information belongs to you, the taxpayer. It doesn't belong to the executive of any government. And one day, I know this is a bad thought, but one day there won't be a Conservative government. And reporters know, we know, that a Justin Trudeau or a Thomas Mulcair, they're not going to roll things back. They're going to like it. They're going to look around, and they're going to say, this control suits me just fine in the system of propaganda with government departments. Holding a government accountable takes information, and I think we're in an information crisis right now within the federal government. And finally, I wanted to talk to you about thinking about media routines and values rather than bias. I know that some Conservatives seem very fixated on media bias or partisanship in the media, or that the media are Laurentian. I don't even know what that means. And this has largely formed an approach to media relations since 2006. But I think if you really want to understand the media, you need to look at it through two sociological lenses: journalistic routines and journalistic values. And a major blind spot, in my opinion, for the Conservative movement is the lack of understanding of how journalists work. When reporters meet that brick wall that I showed you, either in Parliament or with PMO or with government departments, they don't just shrug and say, okay, I'll print that press release that you sent me, or I'll just go home because you didn't want to talk to me. No, no, no. They dig, and they dig, and they dig. They do access to information. Access to information has soared in the last 8 years. They do investigations. They use data mining, databases. You only have to look at the Senate scandal to understand how that works and how it just unfolded. The less that the Prime Minister's office told us, the more the journalists dug on that issue. And it was the same for the sponsorship scandal, and it's the same for the scandal in Quebec that's going on with the construction industry. The great American journalism sociologist Herbert Gantz, who was looking at journalism and newsrooms in the 1960s and 70s around the Watergate era, called it the heating effect. So I thought I'd just leave you with this, this quote by John Rolfe, who was a pre-Confederation reformer who was also an associate of Robert Baldwin. And thank you for not throwing any buns. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Jennifer, and to all the panelists. You don't need to worry about that PowerPoint. You just leave it on the machine. We'll get it to the Toronto Star a bit later. in the day. I do believe we have some time for a little bit of discussion, not okay, well, that gives us time for a couple of questions anyways. You know, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what you've said about, you know, the centralization of control and how this is, you know, hindering the entire parliamentary process. You know, the Prime Minister and I didn't disagree about much. We only really disagreed about one thing, and that was media relations. I kind of felt that he should have some, and he didn't. But you know what I'm interested in coming out of your presentations, because you all touched on it in some way, is how much of this what we're seeing now is a shared responsibility. What role does the press gallery and the political coverage play in what we have now in terms of centralized message control? Because, you know, as you said, I'm old enough to remember the old Reform Party days where there were free votes, there were multiple critics with various positions on things that they should probably agree with. And never once did I see a headline that said, Reform Party has healthy debate about the future of healthcare. So I'm wondering, what role do you see the press gallery playing in changing the system?
Well, first of all, you're right on that, and I should have mentioned that too, that we have a responsibility in the media as well, particularly when you have members of parliament who are social conservatives and they feel strongly about issues like abortion and they put a private member's bill to that effect. Too often, the media treats it as if it's a hidden agenda by the Harper government, and we know the Prime Minister's position on that. He doesn't favor abortion laws, but it's presented that way, and then governments freak out and they close the people down. But part of this is a maturity that has to come by first allowing members of parliament to be able to have a role and to have an independent voice in parliament, and I think the maturity would come with that. I do think, though, that we in the media also have a responsibility, and we often fail.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's it becomes a bit of a vicious circle. At some point where you never hear from MPs on issues, or they never speak out of turn, then that becomes, when they do, then it becomes newsworthy. If they actually spoke regularly in public to the media, it wouldn't be such a news story. Even when I came to Parliament Hill 17 years ago, there was a lot of different viewpoints within the Liberal Party at the time, and you didn't write a story every time somebody squawked, because they just talked all the time. So now when you have one or two that pop up their head, you take notice, and then you get the stories about caucus disunity and so on. But I do think it's a two-way street. I absolutely agree. You know, we tend to be very gaffe-oriented in the media, and we have to work together, I think, to remedying that.
John?
What she said.
Maybe if I can sort of build on this a little bit, because you know we hear an awful lot about the message control of the Conservative government here in Ottawa, and maybe Luisa, you have some perspective on this coming out of Washington, because my sense is that there's a little bit of an element of kind of a global trend in terms of this real discipline in terms of message and what you're putting forward. Do you see that down in Washington? Are there similarities, differences in this tight control?
I think there are attempts at control within the White House, and I think one example would be a recent controversy with the press gallery in the United States over photographs. And the president has an official photographer, and news photographers have not been allowed into a lot of events and moments that have been strictly captured by his official photographer. And there's been actually a lot of objection to this, that what he's putting out are sort of portraits with a message and not just letting news photographers cover the news. But I think there's a huge contrast when you look at the Congress. I mean, every member of Congress and every member of the Senate is an operation onto him or herself, and they have absolutely no problem going out and criticizing the president, even if they're within his own party. And actually, I just finished a piece from Maclean's about the Keystone controversy, looking at the politics of it in the context of the midterm elections. And you have this handful of Democratic senators running for re-election in very conservative states, and the Democrats' hold on the Senate right now is so precarious that just a few seats could tip it to the Republicans. Well, I talked to political analysts there, and they said, you know, in some of these states, the best thing the candidate can do is bash Obama as much as he can. And so to the extent that Obama doesn't approve Keystone, it's better for the guy who's in favor of Keystone, because he can, you know, go to say, I'm not an Obama Democrat. You know, so this is totally par for the course, and it reflects a very diverse country where members of Congress and senators are elected by their constituents. But I wanted also to comment on Jennifer's other point about relations with the media, and she talked about government departments. And I don't cover Parliament, but I do deal with departments. I deal with the Canadian Embassy. And it's striking to me how much information control there is on the departmental level. And basically, when I used to be able to, you know, talk to the embassy, get background briefings on technical issues, and now those questions go to Ottawa, and then sometimes they get answered, sometimes they don't. It takes a long time. I think the departments in the US government, through their media departments, are much more responsive. And I get the feeling that if the question is going to Ottawa, often it goes to die.
It's so ridiculous that you've got communications people that you're paying $100,000 or more. They don't answer their phones. They don't have, you can't even leave a message on their cell phones because they don't want you to talk. They don't want to talk to you. And so you have to email them, and they email you back gobbledygook because it's talking points. So there's no conversation whatsoever on a serious issue that may deal with, say, a public safety issue or rail safety or regulations. You have got nothing. And this doesn't serve the government any good because they don't get their message out, whatever the bloody message is, because it's gobbledygook. And, you know, it used to be where you would be able to call a press secretary. In fact, Don Mazankowski's former communications director would answer his own phone. And you know why?
Oh my
he
God.
he said, well, because that's my job, to work with the media. The people who are working with us, I don't know what they do, but they sure don't do their job. And when we were, it used to be that when you were on a beat or doing a story, you could call the Director General of the department. Now, these civil servants are public servants. They know their field. They know what the issue that they're dealing with. So you could call them, and they'd be able to say, well, here's, actually you're wrong. Here is how this program works, and here's how we're doing it. It's factual information. You get a much better story than one which would potentially be wrong. I don't understand why we cannot call people who work for us to tell us how our program works. Instead, we have to go to some person who apparently is a communications director for a minister, who then goes to the Prime Minister's office to get talking points that come back to you that nobody in their right mind could understand.
There was a very good snapshot drawing together themes that Jennifer mentioned and Bob mentioned in the last week, a real sign of the times. The Post Media Bureau was closed down. When Bob and I were there were 40 people, right? It's now gone. 4 of the staff were taken on by the Ottawa Citizen. And we were having a party to see off a number of the people who'd been let go on Thursday night. 5 o'clock, the main estimates dropped. And this is a book that thick. The thing that they used to have a lockup for, you know, people would sit all day poring over these things with experts on hand to ask, just as we have in the budget. You know, that's the confluence of a shrinking press gallery and a highly secretive political regime, and it's not good for democracy.
Oh, and I should have mentioned this little thing about the estimates. You used to get, every department has a blue book for estimates. You used to have one for the House of Commons and Senate, so you could actually see how the money was spent on the barber shop, the masseuse, furniture, all of that sort of stuff. That's gone. That's disappeared. No more. No more can we ever see how our money is being spent.
You know, it reminds me, Jacques Bourbeau, who is the bureau chief of Global News, we talk about this issue a lot amongst press gallery members, and he had a really good way of putting it. He said, you know, before reporting there was a lot of gray. You understood the gray areas of a policy or a government controversy. But now, the way that things are so tightly controlled, you only get black and white. And if you're unsure about what's really going on, you don't have anyone to ask anymore because everything is in sort of an economic action plan and talking point. So if you really want to bring nuance to your articles, it's very, very difficult to do that. And so it's often frustrating for us because we know we're not getting the full story or representing it in a way that's best for the readers to understand what's going on. But there's just no one to talk to anymore that can talk to you about what the gray area is anymore on these things.
It should be pointed out, of course, that these are the official avenues. And because the official avenues are completely closed, that we've all found ways around those avenues. And people complain about anonymous sources being used. I'm very guilty of doing that, but that's because you're talking to people who will talk to you, but they can't put their name in it. And maybe that's not a good development either, but at least we do still have access to the information in some ways. But as Bob points out, I mean, these communications departments in any given department are bigger than most of the newspaper bureaus, particularly mine right now, given that it's just been closed.
So, I really wish I had the option to avoid Bob Fife, but it's really hard to do when he's got you strapped up against a campaign bus.
That was a moment for the ages, as Bob leapt onto the Conservative bus in the 2004 campaign and said, "Is James Armour there?"
Oh my God! And everybody said, "Well, you look like a deer in the headlights." I said, "You're lucky I didn't soil myself on national TV." Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that we're running out of time, but maybe if I could just do some short snappers along a line here. If you could give me one positive thing that someone could do, maybe even the press gallery could do, to start the change, what would that be? I'll start with you, Jennifer.
I guess just viewing reporters not as an enemy, but a partner in Canadian democracy. I think that would be a good start, and that we're all in it together. There used to be a feeling on Parliament Hill that it's messy, but we're all in it together. We all have the same goal, which is a functioning democracy. That would be a great start.
I think it actually starts with you people. You're the party representatives, whether you're Democrat, Liberal, or Conservatives. It's your job to demand better of your leaders so that there's more openness. Democracy is served much better when there's a lot of fresh air.
I would say just to internalize the notion that not every story is a gotcha story. There are explainers, there are stories trying to explain complicated issues, and they benefit greatly from being able to speak to an expert inside of government who's probably spent years on this issue and is can explain it to you. Likewise, at the Canadian Embassy, they're the people on the ground in Washington. They know these issues. It would be great to see them empowered more to be able to speak about it. I think there's just a great wealth of knowledge, and it doesn't help the cause to force us to talk to outside people who have a specific agenda. There are a lot of smart people working in the government, and if we're trying to do a good story, it helps us to be able to talk to them.
I think Jennifer hit the nail on the head when talking about the media values and the way we do our jobs. A more sophisticated view of the media. If we're not just going to go away, we're not going to. And if the official government sources don't talk to us, then we talk to somebody else. And I've long failed to see how that benefits the governing party when their voice is not in the story and their opponents are. So I think a loosening of the leash with government MPs and the armies of communications professionals, who are all, for the main, bright, smart people who have the access, who have the information at their fingertips, to just let them do their jobs.
Great. Well, thanks. I think it's been a really interesting panel. This is where you sort of burst into spontaneous applause for our panelists. I'm sure they'll be available for a scrum afterwards. You can feel free to scrum them. I'm looking over at Dave because I was given very important housekeeping announcements to tell you, but obviously talking points weren't really my strong suit. Otherwise, I'd be High Commissioner in Bermuda right now. So, Dave, I'll maybe let you tell people what's next. But thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you to all of you. This has been a very interesting panel discussion, and I know that there's people that are having more ideas and thoughts as this conversation carries on as well. So thank you again for everybody.